Welcome to Beyond the Call, where history, leadership, and heroism come alive. Today's story explores Sergeant John Randolph McKinney at Dingalan Bay in 1945, a powerful account of courage and responsibility in combat. If you enjoy learning more about military history and extraordinary individuals, you can find more articles, podcasts, and resources at trackpads.com. In the gray light before dawn on the coast of Luzon, a thin line of foxholes and weapon pits guarded the jungle edge above Dingalan Bay. Most of the men in Company A were still asleep, trusting a three-man machine gun crew and a few sentries to warn them if anything moved out there in the trees.
Before we continue, I want to mention the Medal of Honor book series that accompanies this work. These books tell the stories of America's Medal of Honor recipients in a serious, readable, and historically grounded format, with each volume focused on a specific campaign, battle, or part of the war. They are available in color paperback, Kindle ebook, and matching audiobook editions. You can find them at militaryauthor.me.
Near that gun, Private John Randolph McKinney had finally stretched out under a rough shelter of canvas and bamboo. He had been on watch, had handed the weapon over to his buddies, and had lain down with his rifle close enough to grab. The night was heavy with humidity and the sounds of the jungle, but inside the perimeter there was a sense of routine exhaustion more than fear. Beyond the wire, though, a Japanese raiding party was already moving, slipping through the undergrowth and around obstacles in near silence. Beyond the Call is the Monday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine. The first warning came as a blade, not a shot. An enemy soldier ripped open McKinney's shelter and slashed down with a saber that caught the young private on the head. The blow tore his scalp and sent him to the ground, ears ringing, eyes full of blood. In that instant, he knew the enemy had already penetrated the line and that the machine gun nearby was in grave danger. Somewhere behind him, dozens of sleeping men had no idea how close the attack already was. To understand how McKinney reacted, it helps to know where he came from. He was born in 1921 in Woodcliff, a small community in Screven County, Georgia, where his family worked as sharecroppers on thin, unforgiving soil. As a boy, he was not especially big or strong, and the hardest field work often overwhelmed him. His parents sent him instead into the woods and swamps with a slingshot at first, and then a rifle. His task was simple and harsh: bring home something the family could eat. Day after day, he learned to move quietly through brush and water, to read tracks in mud, and to watch for the slightest twitch that meant game was near. Marksmanship and patience were not hobbies for him. They were survival tools. Schooling ended early, and work took over, and neighbors later remembered him as shy and soft-spoken rather than bold. He did not seek attention, and he did not talk much about himself. Those traits would follow him into uniform. When the war came and the nation mobilized, McKinney enlisted in the Army from Screven County in late 1942. Training turned the farm boy into an infantryman, with long marches, weapons drills, and live fire exercises that sharpened his natural shooting skills. He and his fellow soldiers of the 33rd Infantry Division spent time in Hawaii and New Guinea, learning jungle warfare in heat and rain. They learned how to dig effective foxholes, how to defend a perimeter, and how to recognize signs of infiltration in the dark. Each lesson was paid for in sweat and sometimes in blood. By early 1945, McKinney's regiment was on Luzon, part of the campaign to drive Japanese forces from the Philippines. Along Dingalan Bay, Company A took up positions in the rough terrain above the coast, watching key trails that enemy patrols might use. The outpost where McKinney lay was just one small piece of a much larger line, but any gap there could become a deadly opening. The Japanese force moving toward them that night may have numbered around 100 men, enough to overrun a local sector and create havoc in the rear. Their goal was not grand strategy, it was to break this one point in the chain.
Back at the shelter, McKinney's reaction to the saber blow was immediate. Even stunned, his hand went for his rifle. He fought the attacker at close quarters, using fists and rifle to put the man out of the fight. Then, still bleeding, he moved toward the machine gun pit rather than away from danger. In the dim light, he could see enemy figures already converging on the weapon that guarded his company's front. The three-man crew at the gun had been caught in the first rush. One soldier was badly wounded, and another helped him toward the rear, leaving the position nearly unmanned. A group of enemy soldiers, about 10 strong, swarmed into the emplacement and grabbed the gun, trying to pivot it around. If they had succeeded and opened fire on the sleeping company, the result could have been catastrophic. McKinney reached the pit as they worked, and he climbed into the same small space that now held multiple foes.
At a range measured in feet, he fired his rifle and struck with the rifle butt, killing several attackers in a rapid, brutal struggle. In that confined pit, there was no room for careful maneuver, only raw effort and instinct. By the time the fight ended, the enemy group in the gun position was dead, and the weapon itself had been wrecked in the chaos. The raiding party had been denied its most valuable prize. The cost was a ruined machine gun and a private who was now wounded and alone in the center of an ongoing attack. The enemy was not finished. Grenades began to fall into the perimeter, and the hollow thump of small Japanese knee mortars announced more incoming rounds. Shrapnel tore through branches and earth as McKinney moved along his sector, reloading, grabbing ammunition where he could, and firing into enemy shapes as they appeared. He never stayed in one place long enough to become an easy target. Instead, he used the same hunter's sense he had developed back home, choosing angles, watching likely approaches, and striking quickly.
At times, the fight closed again to hand-to-hand distance. When enemy soldiers rushed individual foxholes or tried to slip through gaps, they ran into McKinney, who met them with rifle fire or heavy blows from the rifle itself. The terrain offered only shallow cover, and every movement exposed him to fire, but he continued to shift and shoot. The raiding party that had set out to break the line found itself stalled and then shredded into smaller, disorganized groups. Other American soldiers, now fully awake, began to add their fire to his, but much of the damage had already been done by one relentless defender.
The Medal of Honor citation that later described this battle uses formal phrases like extreme gallantry and unsurpassed intrepidity. Those words can sound distant until you connect them to what really happened in those dark minutes. Extreme gallantry meant rising from a bloody blow to the head and choosing to move toward a gun pit full of enemies. It meant fighting at arm's length inside that pit and refusing to let the weapon be turned on his own company. Intrepidity, fearless boldness, meant continuing to move along the perimeter while outnumbered, under grenade and mortar fire, knowing that any moment could be his last.
The citation notes that he faced a force of about 100 Japanese soldiers and that he killed many of them personally, including 2 at a mortar position some distance away. Numbers in combat are never perfect, but the scale of the action is clear. One man's stand broke the coordination of a carefully planned raid and prevented the machine gun from being used against the sleeping company. In simple terms, he kept the line from folding. His actions saved lives. On the larger stage, the stand at Dingalan Bay did not decide the entire Luzon campaign, but it kept one vital piece of it intact. The outpost held, the flanks stayed secure, and the regiment did not have to recover from a devastating surprise. For the men of Company A, the effect was deeply personal. When daylight came and they saw the bodies near the gun pit and along the trails, they understood how close they had come to disaster. They also understood who had stood in the gap while they slept. That knowledge shaped how they remembered him for the rest of their lives.
After the war, John Randolph McKinney stood at the White House in January 1946 as President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The quiet soldier from Georgia had been recognized by the nation for what he did on that May morning. Once the ceremonies ended, he returned home to Screven County, where he farmed, hunted, and fished, much as he had before the war. He did not seek out the spotlight, and he rarely talked about the details of his fight at Dingalan Bay. His life after combat was marked more by steady work and family ties than by public speeches. He lived until 1997 and was laid to rest in his home state. Over time, his story found its way into histories, museum displays, and memorials that honored his courage. A stretch of highway in Georgia was named the John R. McKinney Medal of Honor Highway, so that drivers passing through would see his name and wonder who he was. They might learn that he was a farm boy turned infantryman who once stood almost alone against a raiding force in a distant jungle. They might understand that his calm, deadly skill on that morning had grown from years of quiet practice in the swamps and fields of his youth.
When we remember Sergeant McKinney today, we see more than a citation and a long list of enemy casualties. We see a young man who had every reason to be overwhelmed and who chose instead to act for others. His courage under fire protected his friends and preserved a piece of a larger campaign. His humility afterward reminds us that many of the most extraordinary acts in war are carried out by people who never expected to be heroes. By keeping his story alive, we honor not only the dramatic minutes at Dingalan Bay, but also the quieter decades that followed, when he lived as a neighbor, a farmer, and a veteran who had gone once beyond the call.